bell rang somewhere far away, deep inside the stone, or perhaps it only seemed that way because Brother Anselm was not yet fully awake, lying still beneath the rough wool blanket that smelled of lanolin and cold air and the particular dusty quietness that accumulated in small rooms over many years of uninterrupted sleep. The bell rang again and then again, each toll fading slowly into the thick walls of the abbey before the next one came, and Brother Anselm lay there for a moment longer, not thinking anything in particular, simply existing in the narrow space between sleep and waking, where the mind holds no urgent thoughts and the body has not yet remembered its responsibilities. He opened his eyes to darkness. The cell was not entirely without light because the window, which was very small and set deep into the stone wall above the level of his head, admitted a faint gray suggestion of the world outside, a kind of pre-dawn non-color that was neither black nor blue but something in between, a color that had no name because it appeared only briefly each morning and was gone before anyone thought to name it. He looked at this gray rectangle for some time without moving, listening to the silence that followed the last toll of the bell, a silence that was not empty but full of small sounds, the distant drip of water somewhere in the lower corridor, the faint movement of wind against the exterior of the building, the almost imperceptible settling of old stone that had been settling for 300 years and would continue to do so long after everyone currently living within its walls had been returned to the earth. Brother Anselm pushed back the blanket. The cold arrived immediately, as it always did, as it had always done every morning for the 31 years he had lived and worked within these walls, a clean and uncomplicated cold that was simply the temperature of stone and air in the hours before the fires were lit, neither cruel nor kind, merely present, the way the cold in old buildings is always present, settled into the corners and the floors and the spaces between things. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and placed his feet on the floor, feeling the rough texture of the stone through the worn wool of his sleeping socks, and he remained in this seated position for a time, not because he was reluctant to rise but simply because this was the pace at which mornings proceeded in the abbey, unhurried and sequential, one small action following another without urgency. He dressed in the manner he had dressed every morning for 3 decades, reaching for each garment in the same order, the inner robe first, which was cream-colored wool worn thin at the elbows, then the outer habit, dark and heavy, which fell to his ankles in folds that had long since shaped themselves to the particular way he moved, and then the belt of plain leather, and then the sandals with their simple buckles, the left one first and then the right, and he stood and the cold was still. There but less immediate now, present only at his hands and his face and the back of his neck where the hood had not yet been raised. He poured water from the clay jug into the clay bowl on the small table beside the door. The water was from the previous evening and was very cold, nearly the temperature of the stone itself, and it had a faint mineral quality to it, the taste of the deep well in the abbey courtyard, a well that had been drawing water from the same underground source since the abbey's founding and produced water that tasted always and exactly the same regardless of the season. He wetted his hands and touched them to his face, and this simple act of washing, which took no more than a minute, had the effect of making the day feel fully begun, the transition from sleep to wakefulness now complete and unambiguous. The corridor outside his cell was long and low-ceilinged and very straight, paved with the same gray stone as every other horizontal surface in the abbey, worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet moving in the same direction at the same hours, morning after morning, year upon year, so that there were shallow indentations in certain places where the stone was softest, gentle depressions that held small shadows in the candlelight and told, in their wordless way, the accumulated story of all the mornings that had preceded this one. Brother Anselm walked this corridor slowly as he always did, his hands folded within the wide sleeves of his habit, his sandals producing the same soft and rhythmic sound against the stone floor that they produced every morning, a sound that echoed slightly in the enclosed space and mingled with the distant sounds of other brothers moving through other corridors toward the cold chapel, toward the morning prayer, toward the beginning of another day that would proceed, as all days in the abbey proceeded, in its quiet and orderly and entirely unremarkable way. The scriptorium was at the far end of the eastern corridor. He walked toward it without haste. The scriptorium door swung inward on its iron hinges with the low and familiar sound it always made, a sound that was not quite a creak but something softer and more gradual than that, a slow exhalation of old metal that Brother Anselm had long since ceased to hear as a distinct event and that registered now only as the sensory confirmation that the door had opened and that he had crossed the threshold, which was itself a stone worn slightly lower at its center than at its edges from the accumulated passage of feet across many generations of mornings identical in their essential character to this one. He stepped inside and stood for a moment without moving, allowing his eyes to adjust to the interior darkness, which was a different quality of darkness from the darkness of the corridor, more settled and more complete, the darkness of a room that had been closed through the long hours of the night and had accumulated its own deep stillness in that time, a stillness that had a faint smell to it, the smell of cold stone and old parchment and the residue of yesterday's candles, and beneath all of it something older and less identifiable, the smell of years of the same work performed in the same space, a smell that was to Brother Anselm as familiar and as unremarkable as the smell of his own hands. He moved to the hearth first because the hearth was always the first task, the necessary foundation upon which everything else that would happen in the scriptorium this morning depended, and he crouched before it in the darkness with the unhurried and entirely automatic movements of a man performing an action that his body has memorized so completely that conscious direction is no longer required. The previous evening's fire had spent itself entirely during the night, leaving behind a shallow bed of pale ash in which the outlines of the last pieces of wood were still faintly visible as darker traces within the gray, and he cleared these aside with the small iron tool kept for that purpose and began to arrange the new fuel, the smallest and driest pieces of wood at the center where the tinder would catch first, then the medium pieces laid across them at a slight angle to allow air to move between them, and then 2 larger logs placed on either side with the patience of someone who understands that fire cannot be hurried and that the correct arrangement at the beginning determines everything that follows. He struck the flint and the sparks fell into the tinder and the tinder resisted and then did not resist, and the small flame that resulted was very small and very tentative, and Brother Anselm remained crouching before it with his hands on his knees, watching it with the calm and patient attention of a man who has started fires in cold rooms on cold mornings for 31 years and knows that watching is itself a form of tending, that the fire requires in its first minutes a witness, and he remained until the flame had established itself in the wood and the wood had begun to produce its own small crackling, and the warmth, though not yet perceptible, was at least no longer a future condition but a present one, however slight. The candles he lit in the order he always lit them, moving through the room in the circuit his feet knew without instruction, touching the taper first to the 3 candles on the long central work table, then to the 2 on the smaller side table where the ink was prepared, then to the pair mounted in their iron brackets on the eastern wall, and then to the 2 on the deep windowsill, and finally to the 2 beside the catalogue shelf near the door, so that the room was transformed in the course of this slow circuit from a place of near total darkness to something illuminated, not brightly, not in a way that approached the quality of daylight, but sufficiently warmly, the candlelight falling across the wooden surfaces and the stacked manuscripts and the stone walls with their familiar stains and their cracks and the particular dark patch near the eastern window where moisture had at some distant point penetrated the wall and left its record, all of it rendered in the soft and slightly unsteady light that candles produce, a light that moves very gently with the air of the room and gives to everything it touches a quality of being slightly alive, slightly in motion, even when perfectly still. He stood at the work table and looked at the room for a moment in its candlelit state, not thinking anything particular, simply seeing it, confirming in some quiet way that was more feeling than thought that the room was as it should be, that the day could proceed. The preparation of ink was the first proper task of the morning, and Brother Anselm approached it with the deliberate and unhurried attention he brought to all things, gathering his materials from the shelf above the side table in the order they were always arranged there, the ceramic mortar and its pestle, worn smooth on the pestle's handle from long use, the small glass vial of dried oak galls which were dark and slightly wrinkled and produced when he unstoppered the vial a smell that was faintly astringent and dry, the clay pot of iron vitriol with its tight stopper, the folded paper of gum Arabic powder, and the water jug, full and cold from the well in the courtyard, left outside the scriptorium door each morning by Brother Cellerer as it had been left every morning for as long as Brother Anselm had worked in this room. He poured the oak galls into the mortar, the correct quantity judged not by measure but by the sound they made settling into the ceramic bowl and by the look of them, and he took the pestle in his right hand and began to grind, The grinding proceeded slowly, as it always did, as it was required to do, the pestle moving in long and even circles against the curved interior surface of the mortar with a pressure that was steady and unhurried, and the sound it made was a soft and continuous scraping, regular as breathing, low enough to be almost below notice and persistent enough to fill the silence of the room with a texture that was neither intrusive nor absent but simply present, the sound of work being done carefully. The oak galls gave way gradually under this attention, moving from their original hardness through a rough granular stage and then, with continued and patient grinding, toward the fine and even powder that was required, a powder the color of dark earth with faint reddish undertones that released as it was ground a smell both dry and slightly sharp, the smell of vegetable matter being reduced to its essential components, a smell that combined in the candlelit air of the scriptorium with the smell of the wood smoke now beginning to drift gently from the established fire and with the deeper background smell of the room itself to produce the particular olfactory atmosphere of the scriptorium in the morning, an atmosphere so familiar to Brother Anselm that he could have identified this room blindfolded from its smell alone, could have distinguished it from every other room in the abbey without hesitation or doubt. When the powder was fine enough, he added the iron vitriol with the small bone spoon whose handle had been worn to a particular smoothness by the hands of every librarian who had worked in this room before him, a smoothness that was different in quality from unworn bone, softer and more intimate, and he stirred the dry mixture briefly before adding the water in a slow and careful stream, pouring with one hand while stirring with the slender wooden rod with the other, watching the mixture receive the water and change its character, moving from powder to paste and from paste to liquid as more water was incorporated, the color deepening steadily as this happened, shifting from the pale brownish gray of the dry ingredients toward the deep and particular darkness of finished iron gall ink, a color that held within it, depending on the angle of the candlelight, faint undertones of brown and green that would disappear once the ink dried on parchment and left behind only its essential darkness. He added the gum arabic last, stirring it in slowly and thoroughly, and then continued to stir the completed ink for a time beyond what was strictly necessary, because the stirring required so little of his attention that it permitted the mind to rest in a mild unfocused state that was appropriate to the early morning, the wooden rod moving in its slow circles through the dark liquid, the ink turning in the ceramic pot with a barely perceptible motion, everything slow and regular and calm. The parchment he selected from the flat chest beneath the work table, lifting the sheets one at a time and holding each briefly at an angle to the nearest candle to inspect its surface, looking for the thin patches or small holes or areas of uneven preparation that occasionally appeared and that made certain sheets unsuitable for the principal text of a copy. The first sheet he examined was adequate, its surface even and smooth, and he set it on the work table. The second sheet was very fine, notably smooth, with a slight luminosity in the candlelight that indicated a well-prepared surface, and this one he placed at the center of the table and weighted at its four corners with the smooth oval river stones that lived on the work table for this purpose, pressing each corner flat and placing a stone upon it with a care that was perhaps greater than the task strictly required but that felt appropriate nonetheless, the parchment settling flat and taut. Beneath the weights, its surface ready. He arranged the remaining instruments in their places, the quills in their holder to his right, the penknife beside them, the small vessel of fine sand for blotting to his left, the ink pot positioned where his hand could reach it without thought, close enough that the dipping motion required no deliberate adjustment of posture. He checked the position of the reading stand where the source manuscript waited, adjusting its angle by a very small amount, less than a degree, until it sat at precisely the inclination that years of experience had established as correct for his particular eyesight and his particular way of holding his head when reading. He sat down in the chair that had been his chair for 3 decades, its wooden seat shaped by long acquaintance with his particular weight and posture into a form that received him now with an exactness that no other chair could have matched, and he placed his hands flat on the table for a moment and looked at the prepared surface before him, the weighted parchment pale and ready, the ink dark in its pot, the candles burning with their quiet steadiness, the fire in the hearth now producing a warmth that had begun to reach the work table as something more than a suggestion, a gentle and even warmth that would build slowly through the morning hours toward something that could properly be called comfortable. The rain had begun sometime in the last few minutes, or perhaps it had begun earlier and he had only now become aware of it, a low and continuous sound against the thick stone of the exterior walls, softened by the depth of the stone into something diffuse and gentle. A sound that settled into the room alongside the sounds of the fire and the candles and became part of the room's atmosphere, part of the texture of the morning, as unremarkable and as steady as everything else. Brother Anselm selected a quill, dipped it into the ink, touched the tip lightly to the rim of the pot to remove the excess, and turned his eyes to the first line of the source manuscript. The text he was copying was a treatise on the cultivation and medicinal properties of herbs, written in a clear and regular Latin by a hand that had been steady and unhurried, the letters well formed and consistently sized, the lines straight, the spacing between words even, the kind of manuscript that presented no particular difficulties of reading or interpretation and that could be transcribed at a pace that was neither hurried nor impeded, a pace determined simply by the natural speed of a careful hand moving across parchment with sufficient attention to produce letters of acceptable quality. Brother Anselm read the first phrase from the source text, held it in his mind, and began to write. The first letter was a capital H, large and deliberate, formed with the particular care he always brought to the opening letter of a new page, which he regarded as establishing the character of everything that followed. He drew the first vertical stroke downward with slow and even pressure, feeling the slight resistance of the parchment against the quill's tip, feeling the ink flow from the nib in a line that was clean and consistent, and the letter appeared on the pale surface with the quiet definitiveness that was one of the reliable and modest satisfactions of the work, the satisfaction of intention made manifest without distortion or loss. He completed the letter and examined it briefly, then dipped the quill and moved to the next, and then the next, and in this way the morning began its passage through the hours. The sound of the quill against the parchment was a dry and whispering scratch, not loud, not a sound that would have been audible from the doorway, but entirely present at the work table, varying minutely in its quality with the direction of each stroke, slightly softer on the downstrokes where the nib spread fractionally under pressure and slightly crisper on the upstrokes, a variation too small to be called significant but perceptible nonetheless to anyone attending closely, and Brother Anselm did not attend to it closely or deliberately but was aware of it at some level below deliberate attention, the way one is aware of one's own breathing, as a condition of the present moment rather than an event within it. The quill scratched and the ink dried and the letters accumulated on the pale parchment in their slow rows, and the rain continued against the stone outside, and the candles burned with their steady and unhurried light, and the fire in the hearth settled into the long quiet combustion of established wood, and the morning deepened around all of these things without altering any of them. He dipped the quill at regular intervals, the motion entirely automatic, the hand lowering the tip into the ink and withdrawing it and touching it to the rim with the economy of a gesture performed thousands of times, adding nothing to the motion and subtracting nothing, simply repeating it with the fidelity of a mechanism, and then the hand returned to the parchment and the scratching resumed and the letters continued to form themselves from the dark ink on the pale surface, one after another, in the order they had always been in and would always be in, each one requiring a slightly different arrangement of pressure and direction, each one familiar, none of them surprising. The smell of the room in these middle hours of the morning was the smell it always had in the middle hours of the morning, the beeswax of the burning candles warm and faintly sweet, the wood smoke from the hearth dry and clean, the ink in its pot carrying its faint astringent quality into the air immediately around the work table, and beneath all of these the deep and permanent smell of the parchment itself, of many sheets of parchment stacked and stored and slowly aging in the dry air of the scriptorium, a smell that was animal and mineral at once, the smell of processed hide and of the dust that accumulated on surfaces in rooms undisturbed by wind, a smell that was not unpleasant but that was entirely specific to this room and to rooms like it, rooms given over entirely to the keeping and the copying of manuscripts, rooms that had been accumulating this smell for as long as they had existed and that would continue to accumulate it for as long as they continued to exist. The lines on the parchment multiplied with the same slowness that characterized all processes in the scriptorium, each line added to the one above it as each minute was added to the one before it, without haste and without any particular awareness of accumulation until one looked up and found that what had been a blank surface was now covered to its midpoint with text, the letters dark and regular, the lines guided straight by the dry-point ruling he had made the previous evening, and this discovery, such as it was, produced in Brother Anselm no particular feeling but simply the neutral observation that the morning's work was proceeding at its usual pace and that the page would likely be completed before the midday bell, which was neither sooner nor later than expected. He reached the end of a line and dipped the quill. He touched the tip to the rim. He found the beginning of the next line and placed the nib against the parchment and drew the first stroke of the first letter of that line, and the ink followed the nib and the letter formed itself on the pale surface, and the scratch of the quill in the quiet room was the same scratch it had been an hour ago, unchanged and unchanging, a sound as steady and as unremarkable as the rain. The transition from the deep hours of the morning to the early hours of the afternoon within the scriptorium was not marked by any sudden alteration in the environment, nor by any shift in the quality of the light, which remained the same faint gray diffusion it had been since dawn. The change was marked only by the slow and inevitable accumulation of completed lines on the parchment before Brother Anselm. When the final line of the section was drawn, terminating exactly where the faint dry point ruling indicated it must terminate, he did not immediately rise. He sat for a time, allowing the ink to dry, watching the slight sheen of wetness on the dark letters slowly turn matte as the liquid was absorbed into the prepared surface of the skin. Only when the letters were entirely flat and dry did he lay the quill down beside the clay pot. He stood from the chair, a movement performed with the slow and careful stiffness of a body that has remained stationary for many hours in a cold room. The air in the scriptorium had achieved its maximum warmth for the day, which was not true warmth but merely the absence of the morning's sharpest chill, sustained by the low and steady combustion of the logs in the hearth. He stepped away from the work table, his sandals making their familiar soft sound against the stone, and walked toward the archway that led to the archive room. The atmosphere in the archive room was noticeably different from the main copying area. It was a drier, heavier air, concentrated and still, holding within it the accumulated scent of hundreds of leather bindings, old wooden boards, dried glue, and the fine, pale dust that settled inevitably in spaces where the air seldom circulated. There were no windows in this section, only the deep shadows cast by the tall wooden shelving units that lined the walls and formed narrow aisles in the center of the floor. Brother Anselm carried a single candle with him, its small flame pushing back the darkness just enough to illuminate the spines of the books immediately before him, leaving the rest of the room in deep twilight. He approached the first tall shelf on the northern wall to begin the methodical process of checking the volumes. This was a task of touch as much as sight. He extended his right hand and placed his fingertips against the spine of the first book on the lowest shelf, feeling the dry, slightly cracked texture of the old leather and the raised horizontal bands beneath it. He slid the volume out by a fraction of an inch, confirming it moved freely and had not bound itself to its neighbors, and then pushed it gently back into its precise alignment with the edge of the thick oak shelf. The sound it made was a soft, continuous sliding of leather against wood, a dry and rhythmic friction that became the new underlying texture of the room's silence. He moved to the second volume, repeating the exact motion. Pull, check, align. He moved to the third. Pull, check, align. Dust motes drifted in the faint light cast by the candle, turning slowly in the disturbed air before settling back onto the upper edges of the books. When a volume was found to be slightly out of place, protruding perhaps half an inch too far, he adjusted it with slow, deliberate pressure from the flat of his palm, pressing it flush with the others. The physical repetition of the task required no deep thought, only an endless, unhurried attention to physical alignment and order. At the end of the first shelf, he turned to the tall reading desk where the catalog ledger rested. He opened the heavy cover, the thick pages releasing a puff of old, dry air. He dipped the secondary quill kept strictly for this purpose into a small, separate inkwell, and made a single, precise check mark next to the corresponding shelf designation. The scratch of the pen here sounded slightly different than in the main room, muffled by the surrounding walls of books, lacking the slight echo of the open scriptorium. He moved to the second shelf, raising the candle slightly to illuminate the higher row. Again his hand reached out. Again his fingers traced the dry leather. Pull, check, align. The rain outside was barely audible here, buried beneath the layers of stone and the insulating mass of the books themselves, reduced to a low, distant vibration that could be felt in the floor more than heard in the air. Hours passed in this manner, measured only by the steady progression of his hand along the length of the wooden shelves, the soft friction of bindings, and the slow, inevitable burning down of the beeswax candle as the afternoon deepened into the quiet dusk. The sound arrived not as a sudden interruption, but as a slow, deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the stones of the abbey itself. It was the Compline bell, the final call to prayer and the signal that the working hours of the day had officially concluded. Brother Anselm felt the low resonance of the bell through the soles of his sandals before he consciously registered the sound in the air. He did not rush. He closed the heavy wooden cover of the catalog ledger, allowing its weight to settle with a dull, muffled thud that was quickly absorbed by the surrounding shelves of books. He carefully wiped the nib of the secondary quill with a small, ink-stained cloth, ensuring no wetness remained to corrode the tip during the night, and laid it exactly parallel to the ledger's edge. Taking his single candle, he walked back through the narrow aisles of the archive room, passing beneath the low stone archway and returning to the main scriptorium. The air here was slightly cooler now, the fire in the hearth having burned down to a shallow bed of glowing embers covered in a fine layer of white ash. The process of closing the room was the exact reversal of the morning's opening, a sequence of actions so deeply ingrained in his muscle memory that they required no conscious thought, only the steady application of routine. He approached the central work table first. The ink pot required sealing. He took the slender wooden stirring rod which rested on the lip of the pot, and wiped it clean with a piece of unbleached linen, pressing the fabric firmly against the wood to remove the dark residue. He folded the linen square and placed it beside the mortar. Then he picked up the tight-fitting clay stopper. He placed it into the mouth of the ink pot, pressing down with the heel of his hand and giving it a precise quarter turn to ensure it was completely sealed against the air, preserving the moisture for the next day's work. Next was the parchment. The sheet he had been working on, now half filled with neat dark rows of Latin text, remained pinned to the table by the 4 smooth river stones. He did not remove the stones. Instead, he took a larger, thicker piece of unfinished hide kept specifically for this purpose and laid it carefully over the working parchment, covering it completely to protect the surface from any dust or dampness that might settle from the ceiling during the night. He smoothed the protective cover with the flat of his hand, confirming it lay perfectly flat against the stones. Then began the extinguishing of the candles. He moved through the room in the opposite circuit of the morning, carrying his own candle to light the way. He walked to the eastern wall first, pinching the wicks of the 2 candles in their iron brackets with his thumb and forefinger, which he had moistened slightly with saliva to prevent burning. With each pinch, a small hiss sounded, followed by a thin, wavering ribbon of gray smoke that rose toward the vaulted ceiling, carrying the sharp, sweet smell of burnt beeswax into the cooling air. He moved to the deep windowsill, repeating the action. Pinch, hiss, smoke. The darkness of the room began to reclaim its territory, the shadows lengthening and stretching across the stone floor. He moved to the side table where the ink was prepared, extinguishing the 2 candles there. Finally, he returned to the central work table and extinguished the 3 candles that had illuminated his copying. The scriptorium was now returned to its original state of profound and settling quiet, illuminated only by the faint, dying red glow of the hearth embers and the single candle he held in his hand. Brother Anselm walked to the heavy wooden door, passing into the long corridor. He pulled the door closed behind him. The iron hinges let out their long, slow exhalation, a sound of settling metal that finalized the room's isolation for the night. He walked the straight path back to his cell, the corridor entirely empty, the sound of his sandals steady and rhythmic against the worn stone, echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Inside his narrow cell, the temperature was identical to the temperature of the corridor, a clean, uncomplicated cold. He set his candle on the small table beside the door. He poured a small amount of cold water from the clay jug into the basin, wetting his hands and rubbing them together with a piece of coarse soap to remove the faint traces of oak gall and iron that always remained after a day of copying. He rinsed them and dried them on a rough towel. He removed his outer habit, the dark, heavy wool falling away from his shoulders, and folded it carefully over the single wooden stool. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and removed his sandals, unbuckling the left one first, then the right, placing them neatly side by side on the floor. He lay down on the mattress, which was stuffed with dry straw that rustled faintly under his weight, and pulled the thick wool blanket up over his shoulders. He reached out and pinched the wick of his final candle. The darkness was sudden and complete. In the absolute blackness of the cell, the only remaining sensory input was the sound of the rain, which had continued without pause throughout the afternoon and into the evening, a low, continuous, and entirely monotonous drumming against the thick stone walls, a sound that asked nothing, required nothing, and slowly carried the mind down into the deep, quiet spaces of the night.